So we have some exciting stuff to talk about here for the GameCube, as it has now seen probably the most substantial update ever. It has to do with a pretty big hardware upgrade for what's been a long-running mod chip in the GameCube. But what this does now is completely raise the ceiling for what's possible with the GameCube, and I'm really excited for the future of this system. Guys, if you enjoy these videos, make sure you hit that like button, helps out a ton. And if you're new here to the SpawnWave channel, make sure you subscribe down below. So I spent the week checking this out after videos and articles and all kinds of stuff started popping up earlier in the week. I had picked up the parts for it. I went through it in a day, installed them, and checked it out. So we're going to take a look at all of that here, as I did record some of the installation, and then we're going to fire up the GameCube and take a look at what's going on there. But first, let's discuss what's going on. This is actually a new method to sort of circumvent the GameCube security on boot and be able to run different unsigned code. Specifically, though, everyone wants to run Swiss. Like, that's the biggest thing, because it enables a ton of stuff for the GameCube, whether it's loading off of an SD card or ripping your own games. There's a lot of possibilities here. Well, WebHDX released this here. This is a GitHub repository, and it has a ton of files and information, but it is for something called Picoboot. Now, the Raspberry Pi or Raspberry Pi Pico is supposed to be a $4 board. It's really like $8 or $9 because people just mark them up online. Essentially, it's cheap. It's less than $10 for the most part, and you'll find them all over Amazon, eBay. They're very plentiful, and it's not a big deal to pick one of these up at a good price. Essentially, what is happening here is they are using, as I say, IPL injection, which is better than what we've been using, that being the Xeno GC. It's like this little chip that we put on the bottom of like the disc reader on the GameCube. It's a mod chip that basically opens it up and we can run boot disks, which then lets us boot into Swiss. Now, the reason this is so interesting is because it's open source and people have already been working to update it. It's programmable through a USB cable, and it's fully updatable. Like, people are working to update this as we speak now, and the possibilities are like extremely interesting because this board itself is undergoing revisions. I mean, we could potentially have a GameCube that has an M.2 slot, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi all added in. Now, that's most likely going to be down the road, but still, the possibilities here are incredible. So the way this works is you have this Raspberry Pi Pico, and you install it using 5 wires. Yes, there is soldering involved. I know for some people that's going to turn them off, but I did go through the installation myself, and it's not too bad. In fact, if you are a beginner with soldering, I think this is a pretty good one to try out, because soldering to the Pico itself is easy. It's clearly marked, and all of the points on the GameCube's motherboard are easy to get to, and they're all spread out pretty well. Nothing's like when I do those when I did the N64 HDMI modification, as an example. You can go check that video out. The pins are extremely close together. You have to use several ribbon cables, get it just right. There's a little more wiggle room with this installation. As I said, there's 5 wires, and that's it. Taking apart the GameCube, you just need a game bit driver, after which you just switch over to a Phillips head screwdriver. You take the disk drive top part off, and then you'll be looking right at the motherboard. There's a heat sink there with 6 more Phillips head screws. If you can wiggle that off and keep the thermal pad intact, great. Even if it rips a little bit, as long as it has a large surface contact to the chip, you'll be okay with the GameCube. And then towards the bottom of the board, they have an entire diagram online showing you where everything is soldered to. 5 different cables. I recommend having 5 different colors for your wires, and then just kind of keep track of them. I had a little note app on my phone, and as I was soldering them down, I said, okay, this one's ground, this one's 3v3, and so on there. That way, when I closed it up and ran the wires around, I was able to just quickly go through and attach them correctly. Now, I ran the wires pretty far around through the front. I actually bent up the metal frame a little bit to get it out of there, and I ran into some weird issues doing this, mostly because I think the cable run was just too long. Remember, this is kind of like a timing-based thing when the system starts up. Because the wire run was so long, I had these weird intermittent blatant issues with booting where every other one wouldn't work. It would just power cycle. After I cut down the cord length a bit for all of my wires, it ran completely fine. So I ended up settling on a spot on the front of the GameCube to attach it, just using some double-sided Velcro. That way I can actually pull the Pico off just in case I need to do anything with the wires on the back end of it. Now, setting up the Pico itself is pretty easy. There's one file on this GitHub page, and you just drag and drop it onto the Pico after plugging it into your computer while holding down that white boot select button. It shows up as like a mass storage device. You drop the file in, and it'll eject itself. That's it. It's ready to wire up and go. In order to run games off of an SD card, we have to come up with a way for it to interface with the GameCube. And there's this really cool little board. It's a little device called SD2SP2. And it actually uses one of those serial ports on the bottom that no one ever uses. There's one on the bottom that we would use for like broadband adapter, one for the Game Boy Advance, and then this one here. And instead, we're going to go ahead and drop in this little adapter, and we can use just standard micro SD cards. Now, you will have to install Swiss to that SD card. I wasn't really making this video in the sense of creating a tutorial for this thing, so I will leave a link down below to a video tutorial that is very, very thorough step by step. But Swiss essentially is dragging and dropping, once again, files onto the SD card, and you do have to move one file to the root of the SD card to act kind of as a shortcut or a boot file for the Pico to see and then just default to, which is indeed Swiss, which is where all the real fun begins, because now we can see what happens when we turn this on. Now, in the GameCube currently, there is no disc. I don't have like a GD-EMU that's replaced the optical drive, nothing. In fact, if you look at this GameCube from the outside, it looks completely stock. It is a very stealthy mod, I would say, in this. But if I power it on now, it'll boot up immediately into Swiss. We still have the DVD drive enabled, at which point you can go through loading off of that SD card that is plugged into serial port 2, and I have Spider-Man on here right now. The cool thing about this is not only is it very effective with what it's able to do through the upgrade paths and the fact that you can keep your DVD drive intact and you don't have to rely on a boot disk or anything loaded up to a memory card. I don't even have a memory card in this right now. It's very cheap. The Pico itself is under $10. The SD2SP2 is generally under $10. Essentially, all of this can be had for about $20, and it's a pretty good pickup if you consider that, since the GD-EMU was like over $100. They're hard to find now. Getting a boot disc like Wind Waker has become pricier and pricier as we've gone along, and then you would also have to order a memory card that would always have to be in your system in order to load up Swiss. And then at this point, you can do all kinds of really cool stuff. Sure, it's great to have stuff on that SD card, but because we have that DVD drive in the GameCube right now completely open, we can also rip our GameCube games to the system. So if you have games that you would like to back up, especially like kind of expensive ones now, you can do that and you won't have to take them off your shelf every single time. This is through Clean Rip. It also does recognize SD2SP2 just because it's basically what everyone uses now for this kind of thing. But I'm going to go ahead and drop in SSX Tricky here. And there we go. It'll initialize the disk. This process takes some time. Unfortunately, the disk reader in the GameCube isn't exactly the fastest. So in this case, SSX Tricky, yeah, we're looking at almost 30 minutes. All right, there we go. It's all done. I didn't make you sit through the whole thing. It took 32 minutes to rip SSX Tricky, but it is done. I know you can rip these on like a Wii and everything. It's just nice to have this as an option on your actual GameCube to just rip your different games. Okay, so we just rebooted back to Swiss, and here is our dump for SSX Tricky. This one was a dump I tried to do of Soul Calibur 2 that I have, and I think the disc is a little scratched, so it failed halfway through. But Tricky didn't seem to have an issue there. Let me launch this. One of the other nice things about Swiss, and one of the reasons I like being able to use that here with the HDMI adapter, is because there is a way to force video mode. So even though SSX Tricky does not support progressive scan, I can actually make it play in that 480p progressive scan mode just using Swiss like this. So we'll get a much better looking game, which it should have been that in the first place, but either way, that's the thing with GameCube is you definitely have to look it up and see if the game supports 480p, because otherwise it still looks a little sketchy with 480i. It's actually been a while since I've played Tricky. It was such a fun game to play back in the day. I think I mostly played it on my friend's PlayStation 2 at the time. But EA Big was awesome back in the day, whether you were doing like NBA Street, which at the time looked incredible. I popped it in the other day. Yeah, it's definitely aged, but wow, man, back then it was such a big deal when you saw the EA Big logo. Now you see EA's logo and you're like, yeah, see, it looks way better now. That not having the issue with like the interlace or the 480i, it looks significantly better like this. It is a real shame that some of these games just don't have that support for 480p. But hey, you use Swiss, you can force it to work. It still holds up. You can still play SSX Tricky now. What a blast. I mean, the best part, like I said, is the soundtrack to go along with it. Now, I mentioned that we would have like upgrade paths and all kinds of advancements beyond this, and some of that has to do with just advancements for Raspberry Pi Pico, because we're seeing new boards come out. In fact, around the time that this modification was made public and released, a new board was announced for the Pico. That's the Pico W. That has like Wi-Fi now built in for it. And having that attached to the GameCube, having upgradable firmware, I mean, the sky's the limit for this system. There's even talks of an M.2 drive or a slot being in development currently for the GameCube. That would go where like the broadband adapter is. I mean, we're basically using all of the ports on the bottom that weren't typically used for, we could use for data transfer like that. But I mostly just wanted to make this video to bring your attention to this modification, because I think it's the best thing you can do for your GameCube. If you've been interested in the GDEMU or trying to work out how to boot to Swiss through like a save game exploit or something, this is probably the route to go. And I have a feeling going forward, we are going to see a lot of stuff happen with this modification as the start. And really, there's probably gonna be a lot of videos that I do where the first thing I say is, okay, make sure you have your Pico installed. We're going to work towards putting an M.2 in or having Bluetooth enabled, or who knows. Like I said, a lot of things are probably going to be happening in the coming years centering around this modification. A massive upgrade for the GameCube. But let me know what you guys think about this Pico Raspberry Pi being installed in the GameCube, and to me, really opening the system up. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.